Jeremy's War, Chapter 11. We sailed through the night, reaching the harbor of Burlington Bay as the sun rose from the flat waters of Lake Ontario. It took several hours to unload the boats and form up the men, but by noon we were on our way again. Now that we were finally on the move, every hour seemed to count. We marched at a quick step, and men who had never marched behind anything except a plow sweated and cursed the heavy kits on their backs. Every now and then Brock would leave the front of the column and ride down the line, examining the troops, calling for the men to close up, encouraging an exhausted soldier, reprimanding a sloppy sergeant. It seemed to help. The sun was low in the sky when we made camp outside the village called Ancaster. Word came that I was to take the wagon to the general's tent in the middle of the camp. The driver maneuvered us through the instant city of canvas being thrown up, and I found Brock pacing about impatiently. "I was wondering where you'd got to," he snapped. "I need another uniform, and this one must be cleaned." I hurriedly unpacked his clothes and set to work with a damp sponge at getting the dust off his uniform. Maggie had shown me how. I was polishing his sword when he emerged from his tent. "Never mind that, Fields." He took his sword from my hands. "Go into the village and find some place with wine and cheese and bread. I will ride into the village in an hour. Have it ready for me then." "Sir!" I scurried away toward the village, then wondered how I would find wine and cheese and bread without any money. It was too late to ask. I continued on. The village was packed with people. Dozens of men and women walked up and down its street, mostly in pairs. Little knots of half a dozen or so would form, then dissolve, then reform. When I found the inn, it was just as crowded. I had to squeeze through the men who gathered around the tables. The talk was about war. Riders from our column had spread out and ahead of us, calling the militia to arms and to meet here. Most of them had just arrived. There was plenty of argument. Many of these men wanted to fight. The people around here were the descendants of loyalists, and they had no wish to become Yankees again. But the winter wheat was ripe and ready to harvest. This was no time to be leaving a farm. What would their wives do? The men argued back and forth among themselves, lowering their voices only when one of them noticed my uniform. I reached the bar, but had trouble getting anyone's attention. Finally, I shouted at a big, fat man who stood at the end and looked to be the owner. He scowled at me. "What do you want, boy?" I stiffened. "I am Batman to General Brock. He sends his compliments and requests the honor of your hospitality in the form of a light supper of wine and cheese and bread." Brock had taught me to talk like that when doing official things. I still wasn't very good at it. Other officers usually smiled when I tried. But the fat man was impressed. "Pleased, I'm sure, to serve His Excellency," he gushed. "Will His Excellency be dining here?" "No, he asked that I bring the supper to him. He is to arrive within the hour." But I was wrong. Minutes later, there was a commotion outside and someone shouted, "There he is!" The inn emptied. I grabbed the food from the startled fat man and rushed outside. I didn't bother to ask how much it cost. Brock and several officers were talking with some important-looking men at one end of the street. I pushed through the crowd forming around them and reached the general just as a tall man in a tall hat began addressing the crowd. "Fellow citizens, I beg your attention." He was someone important in the village, which gave him the right to launch into a long speech. I caught Brock's eye and raised the covered plate of food and flask of wine. He nodded his head to the side of the crowd. When I got there, he stepped away from the soldiers and the speaker and took the plate. It was dark by now. The only light came from 2 torches behind the important man. Most people there never knew the commander of all British forces in Upper Canada ate his supper standing up while they listened to his speech. The timing was good. Brock was just finishing the last of the cheese when the fellow reached the end. "With the love of our king in our hearts and the strength of righteousness in our arms, we shall preserve our glorious land and repel the alien invaders. God save the king." There was some polite applause, but little more. The men in the crowd knew the British were here to ask them to march away to war. They weren't at all sure they wanted to go, but they'd been promised that Brock would talk to them about his plans, and they had come to hear Brock. The other speeches were just something to put up with. The important man then introduced Brock, telling them the general needed no introduction, and then spent so much time introducing him anyway that Brock was able to finish off the wine. The introduction probably would have gone on longer, except that Brock stepped back into the light of the torches, and the important man's remarks were drowned in a chorus of, "Let him speak! Let the general speak!" The man gave up and moved back, motioning Brock to take his place in the circle of light. Brock stepped forward, cleared his throat, a bit of a bread caught in the gullet maybe, put his hand on the handle of his sword, and began to talk. He spoke quietly, without fancy words. He would have been impossible to hear except for the dead silence that filled the street. Gentlemen, ladies, I am grateful you are here tonight. My purpose in asking you here is to tell you of our government's plans to repel the American invaders and to call for the militia to fight. He outlined the plan of the campaign. He left nothing out. If an American spy were in the crowd, the enemy would have known everything. But the crowd knew that too. They realized that Brock was showing how much he trusted them. Many of you are the descendants of those who came to this colony because of their loyalty to Great Britain. Many others are the descendants of British veterans who were given land in reward for their services to the king. Now you, gentlemen, are being called upon. I cannot promise you an easy time. There will be fighting. You will be away from your homes and fields until the snow arrives. It will be difficult for you and your families. He gazed at the dark faces that gazed back at him from the shadows outside the light. Were they loyal? Would they follow him? It will be difficult, but I believe the end will justify the difficulty, for I believe we shall defeat the invading armies. I cannot promise that we will. I can only promise you that I will give everything, even my life if need be, to protect you from our enemies and preserve this colony for your descendants and for the Empire. And that was it. He turned, nodded to his men, and stepped out of the light, but not before someone shouted, "God save General Brock!" and the cry was taken up by every voice on the street. "God save General Brock! God save the King! God save Upper Canada!" Brock mounted Alfred and, nodding to the cheering crowd, disappeared into the darkness. I made my way back to the camp, to Brock's tent. He didn't want anything, ignored me really. He was bent over his maps again, measuring distances by the light of a sputtering candle. I found him a better candle, then retreated to the wagon a few feet away. I'd fallen asleep by the time the officers arrived, but I was soon awake and listening. "Astonishing, sir. More than 200 men have asked to join us, and we hear that more are proceeding directly to Port Dover. Sir, we won't have enough room in the boats. What are we going to do with them?" "Bless them," he said finally. "Bless them all. Well, pick the men you feel are best to endure the campaign and have them ready to march with us at dawn." All through the next day we marched farther south and farther west. There was something thrilling in the air. After all the months of waiting, now we were going to fight. The men sang songs as they marched. I'd never really sung before, but I found I liked it. All the while, men kept appearing, muskets in hand, asking if they could join the fight. If we'd had more boats at Dover, we could have sent Amherstburg 1,000 men. It was late afternoon of our second day of marching when we reached Lake Erie. Brock had already ridden ahead. As we approached the beach, I could see him marching up and down along the shoreline, stopping every now and then to wave his arms at a collection of wooden boats hauled up along the sand. By now I knew the routine. I threaded the wagon through the encamping troops until I reached the spot in the middle, where they always put Brock's tent. I moved the small table, the chair, and the cot inside, then got someone to help me with the trunk. Then I raced over to the canteen when they were already at work on supper, and made sure the general's meal was being looked after. When it was cooked, I took it back to the tent and let it warm over the nearest fire. Brock came stalking toward his tent about an hour later. He was accompanied by some officers and a man in a rough woolen outfit with a battered cap plastered to his head. The man's face was pale as soap, and it seemed to get paler the more Brock spoke. "This is intolerable." Brock grabbed his supper from me, and for a moment I thought he was complaining about the food. But it was the pale-faced man who was getting the general's abuse. "This is absolutely intolerable. There are not nearly enough boats here to move this army. I may have to leave half the men here on the beach. You could have cost us this war, you fool. But, General, and what boats there are aren't seaworthy. Most of them would sink before we were out of sight of this beach. You would make me the only general in history who drowned his army. Sir, if you would only... We will have to delay. We'll have to spend all of tonight caulking and repairing the boats. Every man will have to work at it. Sir, there are local men who can repair... Then get them here. Tell them we will do everything we can to assist. If a shipwright has an order for me, I will serve him. Sir, I truly believe... Why are you standing here? Didn't you hear my orders? Get to it, all of you. Sir. That night I found myself with a brush in my hand, painting tar over the gaping seams of one of the boats. I had plenty of company, every man in the militia. We were allowed only a couple of hours of rest in shifts, and then we were called back to work. I was covered in a black, gooey mess of tar. It was all over my clothes and hands, and eventually my face. Every now and then the men would strip and throw themselves into the cold waves that rolled onto the beach. They would shiver and rub their skin trying to get the tar off, but it never worked. They came back wet and miserable and were sent straight back to work. All that night and through the next day we were at it. My back ached from carrying endless buckets from huge cauldrons that ceaselessly bubbled with the filthy stuff. If I'd known any more, I might have worked on caulking the seams with pitch, just about as bad as tar, or nailing fresh wood into place where rotten planks had been before. But farm boys aren't sailors, and I did the worst jobs because they were the only ones I could do. Brock was around us constantly. He inspected every boat over and over again, looking for flaws, encouraging the men. I don't think he slept at all. If he got food, it wasn't from me. I groaned the next morning when the drums called us to rise and make ready. Brock was gone from his tent. I had already loaded the trunks and furniture into one of the boats, and now it suddenly occurred to me that I might be left behind. We'd been told there was room for only 250 of the men in the boats. 100 others were being sent back to their farms. I raced down the beach and found Brock giving orders about which companies were going in which boats. I asked the lieutenant what boat the general had assigned himself, and he impatiently pointed to the one at the western end of the beach. I trotted along until I found it. Brock had already had his small trunk moved there. I climbed in and perched myself on top. The boats were packed, almost overflowing. 25 men apiece shoved and jostled for space. 8 of them manned the 4 oars. In the middle of each boat, a small sail hung from a mast. At the bow, an officer stood ready, while at the stern, whoever knew anything about sailing manned the rudder. Until we reached Detroit, he would be the one in charge. The officer was nothing more than an ornament. Our boat was loaded and ready when Brock finally arrived with another officer. He started to climb in, then noticed me. "Fields, what are you doing here? I don't need you. I want you to return to Government House." "No, this was impossible. I couldn't get this far and then be sent back." It was strange. I shouldn't have cared. This war, this army, this man, they shouldn't mean that much. I hadn't wanted to become a soldier. It just happened. I hadn't wanted to serve Brock. Someone else had decided for me. And the war? Well, what did I care whose flag waved where? But somehow, now, I was part of it. It's all anyone around me had thought about, talked about for weeks. It was the reason we were here. I had to be part of it. I wanted to see how it turned out, and I didn't want to leave Brock. I'd gotten used to looking after him. Looking after him was my job, and it was a good job. "Sir," I hesitated. "Sir, I want to go. Sir, you need me." He raised an eyebrow. "I need you?" "Yes, sir. Without me, you'll forget to eat." A laugh rippled through the men in the boat. Brock cleared his throat, and it stopped. "Well?" I could have sworn I saw the ends of his mouth twitch as though he were forcing back a smile. "We can hardly have the general starve, can we? I suppose you'd better come. But if we all drown, don't blame me." "I won't, sir." The men on the shore helped push the boats on into the surf that rolled up onto the shallow beach. It seemed to take forever until the sand stopped scraping against the wooden hull, and the boat floated free in the waves. There was a lot of shouting and swearing as the oarsmen tried to figure out how to make their boats work and those manning the rudders could maneuver their crafts into place. But eventually, we formed a ragged line. Slowly, we began to inch our way across the water, our course west-southwest, our next port of call, Amherstburg.